the 11900K may actually be slower than the 10900K in gaming. Intel, you have failed me for the last time. Ugh. Before that, make sure to subscribe and click the bell icon so you never miss another video. So recently, the prices for all of the upcoming Intel 11th Gen Rocket Lake S processors were leaked online, as well as some gaming benchmarks for the i9-11900K. But real quickly, before we get into the prices and the benchmarks, I just want to say that, whether or not you like Intel processors or you like AMD processors, it's good for everyone that there's going to be some new processors coming out from Intel because, frankly, it's really difficult to get your hands on any Ryzen 5000 series processors right now. So, whether or not the Intel 11th Gen processors end up taking the gaming crown back or not, it's just good for everyone that you're going to have more options to choose from. And on top of that, if Intel comes in at a reasonable price with these processors, it's going to be good for both Intel buyers and AMD buyers because, if you're looking at a Ryzen 5000 5800X and it's like $450, an Intel processor coming in at a decent price could actually, force them to lower those prices or come out with a 5700X. But we'll touch on that more in a little bit. First, let's go ahead and take a look at those leaks. So first, starting off with the leaked prices of all these CPUs. Well, this comes from the Twitter leaker Harukaze5719, and he actually posted all of the prices for these upcoming processors online, and you know what? It's a little bit disappointing. So first, taking a look at the i9-11900K, it looks like it'll be coming in at a price of 499 euros if this leak is to be believed, which, by the way, all of these CPUs have been listed in euros, not US dollars, though I do expect it to be pretty similar. So if it's 499 euros, it should be roughly around 499 US dollars. At least that's where it probably should be. But in any case, that is quite a bit to ask for the i9-11900K because we're talking about an 8-core processor, and I already thought that the 5800X was, grossly overpriced at $450. So if this ends up coming in at a price of what is essentially going to be 500 US dollars for another 8-core CPU, well, I'm going to have to say hard pass on that one, and that is just way too much money to be asking for an 8-core CPU in 2021. I mean, this has got to be a pretty big jump in performance if they're going to be asking this much money. Now, of course, if you go down to the i7-11700K, it gets a pretty hefty price drop coming in at a price of what is going to be supposedly 376 euros. So yeah, that's significantly cheaper, and you're still getting 8 cores and 16 threads. It's likely just going to be clocked a little bit lower, so that's obviously going to be a much better choice here, but that's still pretty expensive for an 8-core CPU. I mean, $375 is going to undercut the 5800X by a significant amount and hopefully force AMD to come out with a 5700X at a reasonable price as well. But still, this is very expensive for an 8-core CPU in 2021. I would like to see the CPU coming in at a price of probably around $350 or less. And then finally, the last one I'm going to talk about here is the i5-11600K, and this is going to come in at a price of supposedly 242 euros. So that's, fairly reasonable. Again, of course, I'd always like things to be cheaper, but hey, you know what? That's actually not too bad. And then, of course, there's a bunch more other stuff you could look at that he listed over here, on his Twitter feed. And if you want to go ahead and look at that, again, click the link in the description below. I will have links to all my sources in the description below. But in any case, enough about the prices. Let's go ahead and take a look at those benchmarks. So if we go ahead and take a look at WCCFtech.com, they just posted an article where they found an actual YouTube video showing full benchmarks of what appears to be an engineering sample of the i9-11900K. Now, of course, since it is an engineering sample, it could be that, the performance is going to be a little bit lower than it's going to be upon release. In fact, I expect that it will be slightly higher performance on release, but, either way, showing some performance of an engineering sample gives us a general idea of where the CPU is likely going to perform in every, in day-to-day tasks. But in any case, taking a look here, it seems as though in the video they state, apparently according to WCCF Tech, that the i9-11900K is being run at 5.2 gigahertz, and it's going to be compared to the 10900K, which is also being run at 5.2 gigahertz. But the weird thing about the 11900K, and I think this is down to it being an engineering sample, is that it actually required 1.48 volts to get 5.2 gigahertz stable on all cores, which of course they actually need to use a chiller to get the CPU to sustain 5.2 gigahertz. So yeah, that required a huge amount of voltage, a lot of power, and it's something that you're definitely not going to be able to cool with just a regular cooler or water cooler. And they ran both these CPUs at 3600 megahertz DDR4 memory. And the first benchmark I want to take a look at is actually the Cinebench benchmark. So if we take a look here at the 10900K, it gets a single core score of 1,388, a multi-core score of 16,535, and the multi-core score is actually 19% higher than the 11900K, which is to be expected considering that it's a 10-core CPU versus an 8-core CPU. But then taking a look at the 11900K, gets a single-core score of 1,582, a multi-core score of 13,864, and that does mean that the single-core score is actually about 14% higher than the 10900K, which is pretty dang impressive considering that this is, 14% jump in just one generation, and for the longest time, Intel has not been giving us any IPC gains, so that's very good to see. And then finally, I decided to throw in my 5800X with just a simple PBO applied, and then I'm also running 3800 MHz DDR4 at 16, 14, 14, 30 with all my subtimings tightened, though I gotta say, memory performance, it doesn't really affect Cinebench too much, but, either way, I figured I'd mention that, and I got a single core score of 1,651 and a multi-core score of 15,679. So actually, my 5800X is not only 4% higher in terms of single-threaded performance, but it also beats the 11900K by 13% in multi-core performance. So yeah, that's very disappointing to see, and I'm hoping that this is just down to it being an engineering sample, because if the 5800X with just a simple PBO is able to pretty much cream the 11900K with a 5.2 gigahertz all-core overclock, well, that is not good news for Intel. And in fact, the news keeps getting worse, because if we take a look at the gaming benchmarks here, it's not too impressive. So first, starting off with Shadow the Tomb Raider, again, both CPUs are at 5.2 gigahertz. They seem to be testing this with either a 6800 or 6800 XT. The whole video is translated, so I couldn't quite tell, but either way, it should be more than enough running these games at 1080p. And the first one is Shadow of the Tomb Raider. On the 10900K, they got 216 frames per second, and on the 11900K, they got 211 frames per second, which makes the 10900K actually 2% faster in this game. The next game up is apparently New Blood. I've never heard of this game, but supposedly the 10900K got an average frame rate of 669, and the 11900K got an average of 665, so they're essentially a draw. Next up, Cyberpunk 1080p ultra settings once again. 10900K gets 75 frames per second, and the 11900K gets 65 frames per second on average, making the 10900K actually a surprising 15% higher in this game. And then next up, we have Assassin's Creed Valhalla, where apparently the 10900K only got 79 frames per second, and the 11900K only got 78 frames per second, which is very odd for 1080p. So I'm a little bit questionable with this benchmark, but hey, I've never played Assassin's Creed Valhalla, so maybe it's really hard to run. But either way, again, we're looking at pretty much a draw here if they didn't, mess up this benchmark. And then next up, we have Total War 3 Kingdoms, where the 10900K gets 140 frames per second, and then the 11900K gets 143 frames per second on average, making the 11900K actually 2% higher in this game. And then finally, we have PUBG, where the 10900K supposedly gets 274 frames per second on average, and the 11900K gets 236 frames per second on average, making the 10900K 16% faster in this game. That's very surprising to see, and I wonder if some of this comes down to the increased cache latency I've seen some people talking about online. Not 100% sure if that's true, but that could be a possibility, considering that they're moving to a new architecture. Their cache layout could be a little bit different, leading to a little bit lower performance for their first generation of this CPU. And then, if we take all these benchmarks and we do an average of the games, it looks like the 10900K is actually 5% faster in gaming than the 11900K. So ouch, yeah, I really hope that this is just down to it being an engineering sample. They mentioned in the video that due to it being an engineering sample, it couldn't actually even hit 5.3 gigahertz yet out of the box. So I'm assuming the reason for that is that because they just don't have a new enough BIOS for it yet. It's an engineering sample, so there's probably going to be a performance uplift that does occur when the final chips hit retail shelves. I would assume that the 11900K is at least going to be as fast as a 10900K. I hope it's actually going to be faster, but either way, these benchmarks are very disappointing to see. And again, I hope this is not going to be the final version of the CPU, because if that's the case, well, a overclocked 5800X just with slapping on PBO, which all you have to do to use PBO with your 5800X is go into the BIOS, enable PBO, and then increase the maximum frequency. So it's basically just 2 buttons you have to click in the BIOS and it's auto overclocked. If that can pretty much cream the 11900K, well, that is bad news for Intel, and I really hope their next generation of CPUs is going to be a lot more impressive than this, because even if what they showed during their presentation of it being, roughly, I think a little over 4% faster on average than the 5900X, even if that's true, it's cherry-picked benchmarks that they showed you, and I think Intel has a long way to go to try and catch up with AMD, because even if they do end up up taking back that gaming crown. They're at an 8-core deficit right now, so they really need to get another 8 cores available on their mainstream desktop, at least move up to 12 cores. Apparently their next, I believe they're called Alder Lake CPUs, are going to be showing up likely on 10 nanometer. Those should have 16 cores. It's going to be 8 cores and 8 little cores. Again, not very impressed. And I have some inside sources inside of Intel telling me that 10 nanometers is not impressive whatsoever. They're really trying to push for 7 nanometer. So yeah, I'm really not even looking forward to Alder Lake. So I think by the time Meteor Lake comes out, that's going to be pretty much make or break for Intel. They can kind of struggle for now, and they can release a couple CPUs, like they can release Rocket Lake S as kind of a stopgap. But if we get to Meteor Lake and we're still looking at a scenario where Intel's not making any significant gains, they're going to have to start looking at, and I have been told that they are seriously looking at potentially producing their CPUs on TSMC, which of course is going to be a huge problem for them, because if they go to TSMC as a last ditch effort to try and get the fastest CPU out again, you have a couple of problems with that. The first problem being that, well, now you're not making as much revenue off of every single chip in theory, because you're going to have to be paying TSMC some sort of fees to, let you use their foundries. So that's going to be a negative for Intel. And then on top of that, another reason why they probably don't want to move to TSMC is because now you're relying on TSMC to get you enough chips, and they're already struggling to get enough chips to people like AMD as well as Apple. So it's going to be just an absolute fight for them to pay probably more than it's worth for them to get enough CPUs out of TSMC on 5 nanometer or 3 nanometer. It's going to be really, really difficult situation for them if they do not get their 7 nanometer fabs ready. So Intel, you really got to get your 7 nanometer fabs ready. We got to get you, you need to come on top again and force AMD to lower their prices, because prices are getting out of control. We're starting to head back to where things were when AMD was not competitive, and I'm pretty sure AMD is going to continue to raise their prices if they continue to pull ahead. Zen 4 is likely going to be a pretty decent jump in terms of performance. So yeah, this is bad news for Intel. Hopefully your new CEO and hopefully some new management can help turn things around a little bit. There's a lot of great engineers working at Intel, so it really just comes down to, can the CEO have the right type of leadership to point them in the right direction, to make the right moves, to try and get themselves out of this rut? Because what I've been seeing from Intel over the last, 5+ years has not impressed me in the least. But hey, that's just what I think. What do you think about the 11900K leaked prices and benchmarks? Do you think you're going to be looking at one, or are you sticking with AMD? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and of course, I'll see you in the next video. If you made it to the end of the video, be sure to drop a like. Every time you do so, AMD and Nvidia get more stock. Also, if you want to see more, click here. You won't be disappointed.